Hi and welcome to another episode of PDA Dad UK. What I want to discuss today is the act of stimming. It's something that in autistic circles you'll hear spoken of a lot. What stimming is basically a self-stimulating behaviour. You'll often see it, most people stim in one way or another. I am neurotypical, I'm not autistic, I'm not neurodiverse. But I stim, and I stim in different ways. So my stimming is, I tend to jiggle my feet a lot, I tap my hands, I'm always listening to music in my head. That's just my form of stimming. And what stimming is basically a behavior or an action that creates a stimulating input. So for me, as I say, I jiggle my feet quite a lot. It drives my wife nuts as I sit there and my feet are going away. It's like, sit still. But my daughter has a couple of different kinds of stims. She'll twirl her hair. I can't really show you that because I'm bald as a plucked chicken, but she'll twirl her hair. And she'll also sing a lot at the moment, which is torturous at the present time because she hasn't quite learnt where to start the note. So she'll start singing and then she'll find the note after the song has started. It's just torturous. As a musician, especially myself, it makes it so much worse. But that's just her way of using the self-stimulatory behaviour. And it's something that can concern some parents, and it's something that can be socially awkward, especially if you've got more obvious and visible stims. It can be much more socially challenging, and that's where a lot of kids really struggle, and adults as well. So it's finding that balance with stimming. And for the most part, stimming is a really healthy exercise. It's actually creating a release of tension or anxiety, or it's creating some kind of a sensory input that's helping with a situation or helping them engage with the world in one way or another. It can become more problematic when the stimming is self-injurious, is the term used. And this can be where it's no longer rubbing or even smelling or anything like that. They've taken it to a point where they're usually harming themselves in some way or another without necessarily realizing. They could be banging their head, they could be scratching the skin, but to a point where it's actually breaking the surface of the skin. That can cause infections, it can cause all sorts of hassles. So I want to look at stimming. I want to look at what causes stimming, why autistic kids in particular stim, and whether or not we should be reducing it, encouraging it, when and if it's appropriate. So let's talk about stimming. So what kinds of stimming are there? There's a number of different kinds. A really common one is verbal stimming, which is also known as echolalia, but that's just the technical term that people use, the professionals use, I suppose. But that's basically where they might find a song or a word or a phrase that, rather than having a meaning, so usually when we communicate, when we talk, we're looking to achieve a purpose from it, and that purpose is to communicate something to someone else. We might even talk to ourselves, which is just clarifying something in our heads. With echolalia or verbal stimming, what this is they'll find a word that they like to repeat, a phrase they like to repeat, and it's not because it has any meaning, it's actually because they like the way it sounds. It could be the way they have to use the tongue to get around a certain thing. It could be just certain points in the phrase itself or the word itself that just creates some kind of a comfort. And so you'll hear a lot of kids that do verbal stimming. Babies and toddlers do it quite naturally. As they're learning words and as they're learning to speak, they'll learn certain things that they quite like. So you get the gargling and the gurgling that kids often do. They might be doing the old blowing raspberries, and it's about the feeling as much as it is about the actual making a noise. They're learning that process. For autistic kids, when it moves into stimming, it's because that's creating something in them that they enjoy. It's creating a sensation and a comfort to them that they're then repeating. There can be visual stimming. That can be where You'll see it again with a lot of toddlers. And it's interesting because a lot of autistic traits cross over with what I call toddlerisms. And with these things, you'll see them in toddlers. When they carry on into older children, that's when you can see it's actually formed a stim. And you'll get this with things like just spinning a wheel around, and they'll just watch it and watch it and watch it. Or it could be a fan on the ceiling. It could be lights. They might stare at certain lights because they're getting a sort of effect from it. It could be patterns and colours. It could be anything like that. That's what visual stimming is. Auditory stimming is where a sound they like that they'll keep on repeating, not themselves, but seeking to hear it. It could be a sound on a toy. So many toys make so many horrible sounds these days. But it can be that sound. They're going to repeat it. It's not because the sound itself has any significance other than something in it is causing that sensation and comfort within themselves. There's also tactile stimming. This is where certain sensations are felt, so it's anything tactile, but it can be things like just feeling. As I say, my daughter has a very tactile stim, which is to curl her hair, and it's just something in that creates that comfort for her. She can see it when she's particularly when she's tired. She sits there twirling her hair. It's more challenging now because she keeps cutting it, so it's not as long as it was. But she'll twirl her hair because that provides that comfort. My young boy is neurotypical, but he has a stim, which is when he's tired, he rubs my ear for some reason. It's a bit disconcerting and certainly interesting in public, but that's what he does. That's what provides that sensory comfort for himself. It can become scratching. It could be just rubbing the skin, looking for certain materials, looking to wear certain things because they feel a certain way. That can be a form of tactile stimming. Another form of stimming is called, technically it's called proprioception. And what this is when it's to do with the space around them. And so a lot of stims involve things like jumping or moving about. They can be rocking, shaking. Hand flapping is a really common one that you see where they're flapping their hands. That's called proprioception, and it's basically just about their space within the world, and it's one that's particularly common because autism often affects how autistic people relate to the world around them, and it's a way of gaining the world around them, if you want to call it that. It helps them fill their space within it. All these things can happen, so it can be verbal, it can be auditory, it can be proprioceptory, it can be any of these things, and it can be a combination of these things as well. So what I want to look at now is stimming a good thing or is it a harmful thing? So a question that people often ask themselves is, why is my child stimming? What is causing this? Why are they doing it? In fact, the better question to ask is often, how are they using the stimming? There can be triggers for it. So often in crowded environments, one of my friends has a daughter who stims when she's at soft play. She finds the noise and the general environment, that sort of buzz and tension that exists at soft play, finds it hard to cope with, and you'll often see her go to stimming, which for her was a kind of a rocking. She'd sit in almost like a fetal position and just sort of rock. Looks disarming when you see it, but for her it was just, that's her way of coping with the environment around her. So you can see triggers, and it's often a sign of being able to recognize certain anxieties. If they're finding a situation hard, a good way to help avoid a meltdown for a child with autism is to look for those triggers. We've talked about that before with meltdowns. When you're looking for those triggers, and a trigger can be an environment, it can be noise, it can be any one of a number of things. But if they start stimming, if you start seeing these repetitive behaviors, then that's a sign that maybe they're not coping. And if you can look for those things, that can be a clue to say, you know what, I need to get you out of this situation for a while. For my daughter, it's often just changing the environment around her. We go to a local soft play here, and it's actually a honey farm, and so they've got a big soft play inside, but there's a nice outdoor area with gardens. And if I see that she's starting to lack the ability to cope, which is when she often leads to a meltdown, and as I've said before, her meltdowns can be quite violent, So in order to protect other kids and protect herself, it's a good thing. I can take her outside. She can have a run around in the gardens, which is a little more peaceful. There's not that noise. There's not that tension and buzz around. And she can kind of let it out, run around. Then we can go back in for a while. And we'll often do that a few times during a session. So they can be a really good way of seeing what's going on, especially for non-verbal kids and for kids who struggle to communicate with autism. It's a great way of being able to identify their anxiety when they can't communicate it to you in any other way. And you'll learn to do this as time goes on, and you'll learn to see the triggers and the responses that they're going to have in order to take that action and help them. I think a big mistake a lot of people make is that they look to stop stimming. I've known it in older autistic kids, so we're talking kids in their teens, and I've certainly seen it in autistic adults, but also with parents who see their kids stimming and we don't necessarily understand it. It's not a criticism of any parent, it's just that thing of, oh, they're doing it, we need to stop that. Especially in social circumstances, stimming can be quite a strange thing and a disarming thing to see. If a kid's sitting there in a corner rocking or flapping their hands, they might look like they're having a seizure. It can be quite hard to explain to everyone around us. And so there's a tendency there to say, we're just going to stop that. We don't do that, do we? We're out and about. You can do that at home, or, but we don't do it when we're out and about. And that can be a problem. We shouldn't be repressing stims necessarily. It's one of those things where there's a fine line between what's a beneficial act and where it starts becoming a problem. So for most cases, stimming is actually a really healthy thing, and there's a lot of autistic adults that will actually argue that they still stim because it's actually a really positive thing. It helps them regulate their emotions, helps them to avoid things like meltdowns and being sensory overloaded and all that kind of stuff. And they've usually learnt different kinds of stims that may be a little more socially acceptable. So things like, they'll chew with their feet, chewing their tongue, they might, play with their hair. Biting fingernails is one that's pretty common, but it can be any one of a number of things, but it's things that they've learned. So maybe biting fingernails in public isn't seen as the best thing, so they've learned to maybe just play with their fingers. They might just be jiggling their feet. They've learned ways to divert the more obvious stims to more subtle ones. For kids, that's not going to happen. But stopping them from doing those stims is actually generally considered to be a harmful thing, certainly by the autistic community themselves. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about something that is close to my heart, which is the best thing we can do for our kids is to actually talk to other autistic people. I've been very fortunate to have made some friends in my life who are themselves autistic, and I interviewed one of them on my last episode, where she's running a business successfully and using her autistic traits to actually focus that business and make it a success. The best thing I've been able to do is talk to these people and understand my daughter. So, when it's something I'll tackle in a later episode, the idea of my daughter occasionally hears voices, that really worried me. Being able to talk to some autistic people, I was able to put that in perspective and understand what's actually going on and why she's hearing the voices. So, having spoken to autistic people and got their feedback, I've realised that stimming is a really healthy thing, because it is actually maintaining that anxiety and allowing them a release for it that's far more healthy than going into a meltdown. There are certain therapies around, which we won't talk about, I'm dead against them, but things like ABA therapy, which basically are training kids to repress things like stimming. They're repressing their autistic traits. And that can lead to major problems down the track, because they're no longer dealing with their anxiety in a healthy way, and it's going to come out in other ways. So I really, really, really can't say strongly enough, you need to allow your kids to stim. Where you need to be more concerned is if it's a constant thing. If they're getting up in the morning and they're stimming and they're doing it till they go to sleep at night, that's where it's become far too intense, and it's actually probably, rather than helping them manage the situation, it's just taking them out of the world altogether. And that's not a healthy thing. That's where you need to look at, maybe some professional help, getting advice, but looking for ways to manage that, definitely. The other situation is when it moves into self-harm. We're not talking about self-harm in the classic sense of self-harm. They call it self-injurious, which is where the stimming can create injury to themselves, and it can also create injury to others. So things like head banging. Now, it can be quite a pleasant sensation if you're just tapping your head. It actually, you can get it. It creates a certain thing. When that starts getting too hard, that's when it can cause problems, obviously. The real issue there is that they can cause themselves real harm, and autistic kids often don't feel pain in the same way that we do as neurotypical people, I'm saying here. So what we would think, gee, that must really hurt, to them it's just creating a certain sensation that's actually quite pleasant. The problem is the consequences. So looking for things like that self-injurious stimming. Another one is scratching. Now, often the stim is, you see, it's just scratching the arms or scratching the hands, doing something that, you know, is that repetitive behaviour, helping them manage their anxieties. However, you can come to a point where you're scratching so hard that you start breaking the skin, you start getting visible scratches that are going to bleed, they can get infected, there can be, you know, all kinds of things. And obviously you don't want to be walking around with cut arms or cut faces all the time. And that's where you need to look at the stimming that's taking place. Is it causing self-injury? Is it causing other people injury? And then that might be a time that you need to say, I've got to act on this, and I'm going to get some help. And that can be through your GP, it can be through a paediatrician. But looking for probably professional advice on that is the best way to go. But you can look at diverting the stim, start teaching other forms of stimming. Look for practical ways that you can help the stimming be more manageable. One often is chewing clothes. So it's quite sensory. They'll chew their collars, they'll chew, might be their hair, it might be, you know, any number of things. You can buy, you know, off Amazon or anywhere, these great little necklaces that are like a Lego piece that they can chew on. There are lots of options available that will allow the stim to become less self-harming. It's one of those things that if they're chewing their tongues or they're biting their cheeks where it can cause an injury, finding something that they can chew on that's safe is a great option. One of the hardest things to deal with as a parent when you're looking at stimming is the social impact. Some stims are quite subtle. Some other stims are more socially awkward. Things like rocking, things like hand flapping can become socially awkward because it's quite disarming for somebody who doesn't understand autism to see these things taking place. So the question comes, you know, do you stop them stimming in these situations? Well, my personal belief is no. I think we, as parents of autistic kids, have a responsibility to kind of educate everybody else. It's why I do this channel. It's why I run the group I run on Facebook for parents of autistic kids. It's important that we're educating the rest of the world on how to deal with these things. And I'm very open about my daughter's autism with others. Not to the point that it's embarrassing for her, but if I need to explain it to someone, I will. I'm not necessarily someone who's going to put a t-shirt on and saying, I'm autistic and drawing attention to it. If she finds herself in a situation where she needs to express herself somehow, for me, it's more often that she's acting out and becoming aggressive, and so I have to remove her, but I then have to explain to people, I'm sorry, this has happened, this is why it's happened. But I find if you're putting a friendly face on and explaining, sorry, my child's autistic, this is really helping her. People tend to be more understanding. You're always going to get that one jerk in 100 that is just going to judge you. And whatever your belief system is, I think there's some form of karma exists in the world. You just got to let it catch up with them and let them be. Don't let it affect you, because that's just going to ruin your day. Do find that most people are really, oh, okay. And the amount of times I've talked to people, actually, you know what, my son or daughter is autistic as well. My nephew, my niece, I've got a friend who has it. Autism isn't as uncommon as people think. And once you actually engage in a conversation with people about it, you'll find there's probably someone in their life that's experiencing the issues that you're experiencing. And so you can draw on that and get some understanding. And it just makes life easier. And it's actually going to make life easier for your kids, because they're going to be able to grow up in a world where people are actually looking to say, oh, I saw that the other day, this other kid was doing that, I understand it now. I'm not saying that's going to be easy for everyone. I'm quite gregarious, I'm quite outgoing, I talk to just about anybody. But for a lot of people, the idea of, you know, meeting in a conversation is challenging and confronting and creates its own anxiety, especially if you're an autistic person yourself and your kids are autistic, then that's going to be a really awkward situation. There's no easy answer, but I think just being able to say she's autistic, he's autistic really helps, and you can just leave it at that. So if you're experiencing issues with stimming where it's gone beyond regular stimming and it's not something that's done occasionally but it's becoming overpowering, it's being constant, or if they're doing them self-harm, please do reach out, talk to your GP. You can get referrals to occupational therapists, behavioural therapists, people who are able to help with these things. You don't want to stop them stimming altogether. They're going to need that outlet. It's cruel and it's unjustified to stop something which is helping. But when it becomes a problem, so if they are injuring themselves, please do reach out for help. A great resource is the National Autistic Society in the UK. I've dealt with them myself. I've had issues where I've actually just picked up the phone and spoken to somebody and they've been able to put help in place and recommend areas that I can reach out to get more help. They're a fantastic resource, so do give them a call if you feel you have more of an issue with stimming. If you're an autistic adult, I'd love to hear in the comments about how you've dealt with stimming, how you've moved through from childhood into adulthood and how stimming's helped you, and how you've learned to perhaps control it in a way that it's less socially awkward. If your kids are stimming, I'd also love to hear about what things you've got in place, how you deal with situations. I'd especially love to hear from anyone that is in that social situation, tricks you found for dealing with other people who don't understand, to help them to understand and to be less judgmental. I'd love to hear it in the comments. Please do subscribe to the channel. I will see you next time.